Thank you. Good morning, everyone. I apologize if you were looking at the guide and saw my photograph and thought I was a bit younger. That was before Brexit and GDPR and the Trump election and many other things. But I'll briefly talk just for a second about what I do. I have a pretty interesting job at Sophos, and then I get to do research and come to events like this all over the world. And unlike most of our folks, that their research is much more directed, like the folks obviously that work in our labs are reverse engineering malware and researching all the ecosystem around how that works. My job is a little bit outside of that, and I get to kind of look at the bigger picture and look at a lot of other things that interact and often may finance or move forward a lot of the criminal stuff that we're trying to block with our products, right? So things like IoT, or in this case, payment systems, in a way all have interactions with our customers and fund and fuel cybercrime often, but they may not be something that we're writing software to protect or selling a product about, right? So my team kind of looks at all these things around the edges that influence the stuff that we do. And for me, this particular topic started 5 years ago. I was doing a lot of research back then on malware skimming, credit card skimming malware. And it was a big problem, especially in the United States. The Target attack had just happened in America. Millions of credit cards were being posted to the dark web on a regular basis. And we were seeing lots and lots of iterations of interesting malware trying to steal credit card data. Now, that's mostly gone away. We don't really see much other than you've probably heard about MageCart. I know in particular it hit BA here in the UK. There is, so there's a little bit of activity still out there, but most of the credit card skimming malware was gone. But while I was doing that research, I just ran across so many interesting things that I had to kind of go down the rabbit hole and figure out how the entire payment systems actually work from start to finish. They're not very well documented, and they seem to be intentionally obfuscated. I presented all this originally at B-Sides Vancouver in 2014. And just really interesting things. Like if you search for credit cards on Twitter, it's shocking how many you can get for free. People constantly post pictures of their credit and debit cards on Twitter, including pins. It's just weird, right? And we've actually seen a resurgence of old-fashioned skimming, like literally rubbing pencils over credit cards in taxi cabs and things like this around the world, rather than using high-tech methods. So there's just all kinds of weird things going on. But how do these, payment systems work, especially all these new things? Because we've all got, not only do we have chip cards, but we're going tap to pay. We got PayWave. We got PayPass. We've got, in America, they've got Venmo now. You can, email people money. And in China, they got Alipay, Alipay and WeChat Pay. And there's lots of innovation happening in payments. Unfortunately, I thought I'd start by looking at, what has the impact been of this move away from the magnetic stripe and toward EMV, as it's known, Eurocard, MasterCard, and Visa, that define the chip standards. And I did this presentation in Vancouver as well for our B-Sides, and this was the numbers in Canada. It's pretty astounding the impact that moving to chip has had. In Canada, we adopted the new cards in 2008, so after you, but long before the Americans did. And we can see that total fraud of all types went from $245 million a year to $67.5 million a year after the introduction of the chip. Now, card not present fraud, though, doubled, which is, of course, what we would consider mostly all online transactions. I mean, I suppose a few of you may still shop by catalog and call phone numbers and give your credit card to agents. But almost all card not present transactions these days are Amazon and things like it. And we are seeing a pretty dramatic increase in the amount of online fraud because it's gotten harder and harder to do card present fraud. And I just found there were some interesting stats. I had to do a lot of digging around. We're now doing 93% of our transactions in Canada via chip cards, and only 11% of fraud was people literally trying to make duplicate fake cards with like stolen data they bought from criminals. Now, the UK publishes slightly different stats, so I wasn't able to do exactly like for like, but there is a government website here that tracks financial fraud that publishes a lot of numbers, so I was able to pull up a lot of it. Unfortunately here, since the introduction of chip in 2005, which is kind of that was when chip was mandated. Most of you probably got chip cards in 2002, 2003. So when the banks started issuing them, but it was required for merchants to accept them in 2005. And it was 427 million pounds now. Total fraud now is up to 18 million pounds. And card not present fraud, like in Canada, went up, but not as much as it did in Canada. So it's kind of interesting to compare that. I don't know why that says in Canada. I have a typo, so we'll pretend that says in the United Kingdom, because that's what it means. The number is correct. The label is wrong because I copied the previous slide and pasted it. And only 6% of fraud here was done via fraudulent or copied cards. And 96% is, they don't measure UK specifically, and MasterCard and Visa measure what they call Europe Zone 1, which is pretty much EU member states. Europe Zone 2 is the kind of affiliated EU states that aren't quite EU. So Ukraine, for example, is Europe Zone 2, whereas Europe Zone 1 is pretty much every European country that you would think of. So kind of interesting data. Here's card present fraud. So we do see the card present part. If we just take that out and not the total fraud in the UK, there was a precipitous decline after the introduction of the ICC chips or the EMV chips. It kind of leveled out here after about 2011. Card not present, we could see slowly increasing over time, especially at the end of the chart. So this is really the preferred way to commit credit card fraud these days. Not trying to give you ideas if you're looking to become a credit card fraudster, but online is where it's at. And again, the counterfeits just dropped right off once everybody expected to see a card with a chip. I mean, it's just too, it's not that it's impossible, it's just too difficult. Not worth it. You always go for the low-hanging fruit, as we learned from the malware authors. EMV adoption in general, it's pretty much global now, right? There's almost nowhere lagging behind except the United States, and that's its own bizarreness, and as soon as they catch up to us, we'll probably see the magnetic stripe go away. I'll talk about that a little bit more with TAP, because there's some interesting things. Now, one of the problems with doing research in this area is there's a lot of acronyms. I mean, a lot of acronyms. It's just crazy amounts of acronyms. And I'm not going to define all of these, but there's a few of them that are kind of interesting when you're looking at it from a security standpoint. Of course, CNP is card not present. PAN is the primary account number. So that 16-digit on the front is called a PAN. And the ICC is the technical name for the chip. It's an integrated circuit chip. We've got CPP, which is the way we usually detect that somebody's been compromised. So CPP means common point of purchase. So when you see suddenly a whole bunch of fraud at a given bank, Santander sees all kinds of people getting complaining about fraudulent charges. They go look for a common point of purchase that all their customers shopped at the same place, and then they can figure out that it was the Sainsbury's on this road that must have had a compromised terminal and was collecting pins, or whatever was happening that allowed the fraud to happen. I think the last really big fraud here in the UK related to this was the Shell gas station pumps in 2008, 2009 that were rigged up to steal stuff, and we'll talk a little bit about that too, because there's been some evolution of the chip. It's not the same chip that, it's the same chip. It's just implemented differently today than it was when it was first introduced here, in the UK. So, a modern card, if we look at them, it's just a smart card, right? If you use a smart card to authenticate to a laptop, I was able to buy 10 of these on Amazon for $3.99. That's all a modern card is. It's the exact same chip. If you look at it, of course, the same chip that's a SIM chip as well. It's the exact same design, the same concept. These little chips actually run an operating system. Most of the operating systems that run on them are written in Java, which is why they're so secure. And most of them are produced by Gemalto. I mean, Gemalto is the largest producer of chip credit cards in the world. Most of the credit card suppliers, or most of the banks, contract with Gemalto to provide their chip or their cards. And they're quite easy to read. If you have a tap card, if you have a PayWave or whatever, you can load up an app on your Android, EMV card reader. There's a bunch of them out there, but you want to be careful which one you use, because it does get all the information for your credit card. And if you don't know who supplied you the app, you may be in for a surprise. So like myself, you may just be careful and use one that's been expired if you want to play around with it. And that's actually my credit card information right there. Now, and what you see there is you see it says card AID, so that's an application ID. So the little operating system has a file folder structure on it, and there's application IDs, and those application IDs define what types of things that card does. So technically a card could be a Visa and an Amex at the same time. It could present multiple application IDs to the payment terminal. And it does that if you have one of these. I don't know if you have them here in the UK. I know they have them in the States. We don't have them in Canada yet. Ones that are credit cards and debit cards in one card from your bank. It actually does that. It presents two application IDs to the payment terminal. And that's why the payment terminal then prompts you and says, oh, do you want this to be a credit or a debit transaction? Because it's seeing that I've got multiple choices that I support for this transaction, because this card has presented me with multiple identities, if you will. So if we're looking at this, right, you got your payment terminal. The first thing the payment terminal does is query those application identifiers. Now, I've shortened this down a little bit. Literally, this is like a 4-hour thing to explain if I had to go through the detail, but I'll kind of give you the high level. It queries for those application identifiers, and then it selects a supported one, and if there's more than one that's supported by that payment terminal, it provides you with a choice. This is also why, if you have an American Express card, which is not very usable here or in Europe, if you put it in the terminal, it'll sometimes say application not supported, instead of saying, I don't accept Amex. Because it's basically looking at those application IDs and going, I don't know what this one is, so I can't do that. So it may ask you to choose. It reads the application file locator to determine what kind of card details are on there. And so those files on the file system of that chip will present them the primary account number, the expiration date, maybe the credit limit, all kinds of other details, including sometimes some transaction counters that can be used to trigger certain situations, that kind of stuff. It then moves into data authentication mode, right? So this is not where it authenticates you with your PIN. This is where it authenticates that the data itself hasn't been tampered with. So the data on the cards are protected using different standards. Sometimes they're digitally signed, sometimes they're encrypted. Depends on the generation of card and what it supports, and I'll go into a little bit of the detail there. That only happens if it's an offline transaction. If it's an online transaction, it assumes that the bank in that online transaction is going to confirm the details at the bank end and know that the card is valid. So it doesn't bother to validate that the information on the chip hasn't been tampered with, because the bank should know that if you sent bogus data to them. And then ultimately, if all that passes, it goes to cardholder verification, which again is a sort of a multiple choice test. You can see some of the details you can get from cards, what things they support when you put them into these applications, because these identifiers are rather difficult to read for humans. So this app actually interprets them. That top one there is actually a Visa card on the previous one. You can see it supports dynamic data authentication and issuer authentication, meaning that the public key for the financial institution that issued the card is on the card. That means you can validate you're actually talking to the financial institution and not a criminal. And this other one, supports some other features. We see it has terminal risk management, which is a way to try to determine whether the terminal itself may be compromised that's performing the transaction. So if you're offline, which doesn't happen very often anymore, but this is one of the reasons the gas station attack worked at Shell here. They were doing offline authentication. More and more, at least in Canada and the US, where we have chips and use them, pretty much everything's online. I don't know of anything that's really offline. For a while, the airlines were doing offline data authentication when you were buying a Pepsi or whatever on a flight. Most of that's even online now that we have internet on board the jets, and everybody prefers online because it reduces fraud. But if you are offline, these are kind of the 3 stages, right? In the old days, everything was just static data authentication. So the card presented the data to the terminal, and it was digitally signed, and the terminal just looked at the data in the signature and made sure that the signature hadn't been altered. And the certificate authorities were a pre-approved list issued by the card associations. They later moved on to dynamic data authentication, which pretty much every card in circulation today has. Nobody uses SDA anymore. Modern cards either have DDA or CDA. And in the dynamic mode, there's some weird stuff. Like, you can tell that bankers made this up as they went and then forced technical people to implement it. It's some really interesting things. So rather than calling it a seed or a nonce or anything like that, we have an unpredictable number, which I think is their way of saying random. This should not be serial. Now, of course, if you look into credit card compromise of chips, one of the things you'll find is that, in fact, most of the terminals don't use an unpredictable number, which means that you can actually compromise them. But they're supposed to use an unpredictable number. It sends that unpredictable number to the card. The card hashes the data plus the unpredictable number on the chip itself using SHA-1, and then signs it using and this is in the spec again, who's ever specified a key length in bytes? 284 byte RSA key, which if you do the math is 1984 bits. It's not 2048. It's not 1024. No, 1984. I'm not sure if this is a Orwell call out or, I suspect what it actually is that 64 bytes are needed for something else, and there's such limited memory in these chips that they had to cut 64 bytes out of the key to make room for something else they needed. But anyway, that's what they do. And that makes it replay resistant, right? SDA, you could just sit there and replay transactions because it's just checking that the data was signed and hasn't been altered. Whereas with dynamic data, because of the unpredictable number, you can't replay a transaction because that number should be unpredictable. When it is predictable, you can replay a transaction, and it's happened. Lastly, and this is what most things should use these days, and they changed the terminology again. Now we don't have an unpredictable number. We have a 64-bit nonce. It sends that to so the card sends that to the terminal. The terminal then generates its own unpredictable number, but not a nonce, because we copied and pasted from the other spec. Combines that with some padding, original nonce headers, encrypts it using a RSA public key, and then the card decrypts that to check that the original nonce is right, to verify that the terminal has done the transaction. So kind of a little more complicated. Then we move on to verifying you, the cardholder, and these are the four most common methods. So this is called CVM, or cardholder verification methods. We have online PIN, which is kind of what we prefer, maybe. Once we go through how online PIN works, it's not quite as good as it sounds. But nonetheless, of course, you collect the PIN entry device, collects the PIN. It often encrypts it, sends it to the next hop for PIN verification. Offline PIN does it in the chip. And this is another vulnerability. Researchers here, almost all the research on this for vulnerabilities has been done at the University of Cambridge. And some really great stuff. Go out there, look at, they've got some YouTube videos. They overplay it a little bit. But it's still foundationally great research on what the vulnerabilities are in the chip system. But offline PIN, of course, sends the PIN to the card, the chip on the card, and says, is the PIN right? And of course, the problem there is you can put a shim over the top of the chip and just respond yes no matter what PIN was entered. And the terminal goes, okay, and does the transaction. And the Cambridge students actually demonstrated that in the canteen at Cambridge, where they built one of these shims for a legitimate credit card for a BBC filming, to show that they could just put 0000 in for the PIN, and it would do the transaction even though that PIN wasn't correct. It's a little cumbersome. It's a little awkward. It's not believed. I don't believe that there's ever been proof that it's been done in the wild. There's been some suspicion that some criminals may have done it. It's not terribly expensive to do. It's just, it's complicated, and whenever you're doing card present fraud, there's a much higher risk of ending up with handcuffs. So criminals really prefer card not present fraud because you don't generally end up in prison. And then there's offline PIN encrypted. So that obviously implies that the normal offline PIN method isn't even encrypted. Literally, the terminal sends the clear text PIN to the chip and goes, is this right? Whereas in the other mode, it will actually encrypt it using the RSA public key that's on the card. And then the card, of course, keeps its private key in the secure element in the chip to verify that things signed with its public key were in fact enciphered for it. And then lastly, of course, signature verification, which they're still really fond of in the United States. Everything ultimately falls back to signature, and both Visa and MasterCard now no longer require a signature for signature verification. So I call it no verification, because you don't actually need to sign even when it says sign. They realize what a farce that is, and that nobody's ever verified a signature, and that people aren't handwriting experts. So they just kind of went, yeah, you don't have to bother with that. We accept it. So online PIN verification. It sounds good until you start looking at how it actually works. You put your card into the terminal collects the PIN, and it basically sends it to the acquirer, or often there's third parties before the acquirer that terminal is contracted to work with. So when you see the name on the terminal of the bank or the company or the financial institution, usually that's the first hop, right? They're considered the acquirer. The problem here is you see that it's encrypting and decrypting it at every single hop along the way. It's not encrypting it to the bank. It's not using the bank's public key, which is on the card. It could, but it doesn't. And it will basically use a key that's hard-coded in the terminal, a static key, to encrypt it, to send it to the acquirer. Then the acquirer decrypts it, uses another static key to send it to the next hop, to the next hop, to the next hop, to the next hop, until it gets all the way to the issuing bank. That's what the CIB is, card issuing bank. They verify if the PIN is correct. So anywhere that there's compromise, anywhere in this entire ecosystem, your PIN's toast. Because they all have access to it all along the way at each hop. Not incredibly well designed. If you want more on that, there's a URL. I'll make all this available. Anybody wants anything, please talk to me afterwards. And if B-Sides isn't providing it, I'm happy to give you a link or point you to where I'm happy to share everything I know, including the source materials for a lot of this. I had to do a lot of digging. They don't publish much. I found like open FTP sites with white papers on them and stuff. It was pretty interesting. Then it goes into the risk management mode, right? So you got processing restrictions. Maybe this card is only able to be used online mode. It can't do offline mode, there's lots of different kinds of analysis that can go on here. Like if you use tap cards, they're often set where you can only tap 5 times before you have to enter your PIN again. So if you tap twice and then you go do a chip transaction somewhere, it'll just keep working. But there's a risk management thing going. After 5 taps, I'm going to make you enter a PIN somewhere because somebody might have stole your card. Or somebody might have tapped your card 5 times on the tube with a reader, and that limits the fraud, right? Because you can only do 100 pounds per tap, and that means you could really only have 500 pounds of fraud if you can only do 5 taps before you require PIN verification. So it's a risk. There's a lot of these risk management limiters that are built into the decision-making process during a card transaction, and ultimately, in the end, they make an online-offline decision. Sometimes that requires, there may be a requirement for online, and if needed, they do it online. So this is kind of how it works. If you read in the data from the chip, the encryption used is 2 times 3 DES. So don't confuse that with 6 DES. And it's DES 3 times twice, which has its own extra flaws. And then it takes kind of the cardholder data, most of this stuff, so, transaction counter, profile IDs, all this stuff, and combines it with some of the data from the terminal. How much money is this transaction going to be? What is the unpredictable number? Which currency code are we doing the transaction in? All that kind of stuff. And it combines it all into an application request cipher. So it's sort of like a little encrypted token that represents this transaction with all that data that was put into it. And then it takes that, the card takes that, sends it to the terminal passes it to the acquirer, and, through that whole chain that I showed earlier until it gets all the way up there. Ultimately, the issuing bank gets it and has to decide whether they approve the transaction. Usually they're going to be storing all these keys in a harbor security module somewhere. So when you get when they're minting cards, they're issuing private keys, private public key pairs to each card, and then they keep copies of the keys in their HSM at the bank. So they verify that the restrictions, they make sure you're not over your credit limit. They do all that kind of stuff. They grab the keys to do the decryption itself to validate that, yes, the card signed this transaction. It was definitely issued by this card. They decide their response, and then they do a response cipher. So they generate a response cipher, encrypt that using the public key of the card, and then it gets passed back through the chain. So in the middle, these guys have no idea what's in these ciphers. They don't know what's in the request. They don't know what's in the response because it's encrypted from the bank to the card and from the card to the bank. And if it's approved or denied, you get 2 different responses here. So if the card gets it back and reads it and goes, okay, the bank approved this transaction, it's valid, it sends a certificate to the terminal, and that certificate basically is what allows the terminal to collect the money from the bank. They have to have that to prove this is the, proof that encrypted transaction happened and you owe me £29.17 or whatever the transaction was. If it's denied when it decrypts it, it sends basically a equivalent to the certificate that's a denial back to the terminal saying the transaction was declined. Now, tap to pay is very similar. It's mostly based on the EMV standard with some caveats. And, these are the primary. In Canada, we have what's called Interact Flash, which is our debit system. But mostly internationally, we see PayPass, PayWave, and Amex. Amex actually had a brand for a while of their tap, and then they got rid of the branding. I'm not quite sure why. But really not a lot of other tap systems out there. They're all pretty much one of these 3. And there's 2 modes. Again, we have to accommodate Americans because we like their tourist money. So we all want to accept their credit cards, but they're also still in the Stone Age and refuse to use modern technology. So most of us, when we tap, end up doing what would be the EMV version of tap. But the terminals often still support something called MSD, or magnetic stripe data mode, because the American cards don't have EMV chips. So there's no way to do EMV because there's no processor running Java. So they have to do something simpler, which is just hard code magnetic stripe data off the stripe into the tap chip, which is exactly what it sounds like. It's really being phased out quickly now, though. Now that the U.S. officially transitioned, even though their cards, the cards are all chip in America now, the terminals aren't. So they're kind of halfway there, but that means their cards, when they come here, can do EMV mode now. So this is slowly being phased out. I wasn't able to find any data on if it's already been phased out here in the UK. I believe it has. I think you guys went earlier. We're so dependent on Americans spending money in Canada that we extended out our willingness to accept this insane mode of operation until this October, and we're finally cutting the cord because most cards are there. One of the differences, of course, between tap and chip and pin is, of course, there's no non-repudiation, or provides non-repudiation, but there's no issuer authentication. Because they don't want you to have to sit there and hold the chip on the terminal while it talks to the bank, and the bank responds, and the request token comes back, and all this stuff, because you tap and walk away, there's no ability to validate that the response was signed by the bank. So you do lose issuer authentication. It's not known to be abused, but it is a weakness in tap that's not present in a valid chip transaction. I'm a big fan of tap to pay because of all the risk limiters in it, and the fact that as a consumer you have zero liability no matter what goes wrong. So it's £100 per tap, and I don't have the data in here. The CVV changes every time you tap the card. So like if I tap you on the subway, I do get your magnetic stripe data ultimately. I get the PAN number, I get the expiration date. I get a dynamic CVV though. So even if I want to go and buy something at Tesco with the tap fraudulently, I'm limited to that one tap, because then the CVV changes and I have to go tap your card again to get the next CVV. So it's kind of limited based on the bank's transaction counter limit. How many taps will they allow before they require a PIN is kind of the limiting factor, because I could go on the tube with my Android and tap your bum 5 times, get your next 5 CVVs with the card data for tap transactions. But now I'm going to race condition with you. If you go use your card, you'll skip ahead to a more recent CVV, and the bank will go, all those other ones are invalid. So I have to do the fraud before you use your card again. If you do a chip transaction anywhere, I also will get locked out. They'll know that. And there's a high risk of being caught, and I'm only going to get £100, and it's just not worth going to prison for £100. So I think that's why we don't really see much tap fraud, and the convenience of it can't be beat. Now, I prefer to tap using my Google Pay. I'm not an Apple guy, but either way, they're both the same thing. And everybody thought Apple just did amazing things when they launched Apple Pay. What Apple did was implement part of EMV that everybody else was too lazy to do. The EMV spec has had Apple Pay in it since like 5 years before Apple implemented it. It's been part of the standard forever. But nobody ever implemented it. And Apple was the first to implement it, branded as Apple Pay. Of course, Google Pay is the exact same technology, branded as Google Pay. And it's a little bit different. The primary thing is that middle bullet, right? I mean, we haven't really seen use yet of the first, but you may see it. So back to the £100. The theory here is your iPhone can say, I did facial recognition to unlock the phone, and pass that along with the transaction. Or you fingerprinted the Touch ID, or you did the fingerprint on your Android, or whichever. You can say there was a biometric authentication. You can say there was a PIN authentication. And the banks theoretically want to be able to increase that spending limit. They want to say it's okay to buy a flat screen TV at the electronics store via tap without a PIN because you used your fingerprint to unlock your iPhone or your Android. They're not doing it yet, to my knowledge. I'm not seeing it, certainly not on my phone. I'm still at $100 and it tells me I have to enter a PIN or use my card. But that's one of the things it supports that could be in the future more convenient again for us when we're paying with our phone devices. It also uses tokenization, which is the most key thing for preventing fraud, and I'll explain how that works in just a second. And it also communicates to the user whether it was accepted or declined, kind of stopping some of this replay kind of stuff that can happen where you might fraudulently convince a terminal that something was accepted. But because there's an out-of-band communication, right? The bank can talk to your phone over the internet, and your phone's talking to the terminal via tap. There's sort of 2 separate communication channels that prevents more lying and fraud kind of things and allows more verification. So if we look at it, in essence, when you register your card with Apple Pay, what you're really doing is registering a token that represents the card information that doesn't actually contain the card information. And those tokens are generally now being, I think initially Apple was doing some special things with certain banks and things. These days, any bank that wants to support Apple and Google Pay basically is contracting out to MasterCard and Visa. MasterCard and Visa provide this tokenization as a service. And the great thing is they can issue multiple tokens for the same card. So you're not in the situation where your credit card gets canceled and all of a sudden all your automatic billing stops, right? You can have multiple tokens represent the card, and if a token's compromised for some reason, you can just kill that token and maybe other tokens can continue to live with that card information. And in essence, so this is sort of the registration process, right? You put your card data on your phone registers with Apple or Google Pay, they go get a token, send the token back to the phone. Now, when I say multiple tokens, if you had 2 iPhones, you could register that card on a second iPhone, you'll get another token that's distinctly different. But it still represents the same cardholder information in this database that basically is just a mapping of those tokens to PAN numbers from the issuing banks. And then when you go to use it, the terminal never gets any of your card data. And that's the best part of it, right? The phone presents the token to the terminal, and the terminal has to use the token as the identifier for the transaction in the process. The terminal sends it to the token service provider, usually Visa. They go look up the token, figure out what card number it is, send the transaction data with the card number to the issuing bank. The bank goes approve, decline. It goes back, and then Visa signs a token, sends it back, and goes, it's all good. So the benefit of this also is issuing bank doesn't know where you're shopping. Privacy. Only Visa, the token issuer, knows the issuing bank and where the transaction came from. And so as long as you trust them to keep the tokens secure and not sell your information, which so far it looks like there's going to be legislation to prevent that, and they don't appear to be selling it at the moment to my knowledge, you're also getting a lot more anonymization. You would be surprised how much money your bank makes from selling where you shop to companies out there. When I was looking into Venmo in the States, Venmo, it's estimated that Venmo makes $400 per customer per year just selling their transaction information. So that's very valuable information. It's very valuable to your privacy, and tokenization is your friend. So a couple more things, and then I'll take some questions and we'll wrap up. Some of the new wave of stuff. I mentioned Venmo. There's a lot of, PayPal ultimately bought them now. Venmo's sort of it was meant to be a social network for payments. What could possibly go wrong? And it has gone wrong in brilliant ways, but some interesting things about it. So that social network idea is literally, you share your contact list, of course, with Venmo. Why wouldn't you? And then all your friends that are using Venmo, and it's like, hey, Harry just bought coffee at the Costa Coffee Shop on Warwick Road. And wouldn't you want to buy coffee there? Because Harry's a trendsetter. This kind of thing, I guess, is the concept. And apparently it works. They make a lot of money off of the kind of social network aspect of it and sharing your payment information. Of course, that's on by default, as it would be. You don't have to opt in to do this. If you subscribe to Venmo, you broadcast to everyone you know by default everywhere you shop, because sharing is important. And oddly, people get frauded a lot on it because it's a ledger-based system, meaning until you cash out, the money's sort of virtual. Meaning, let's say I owe you $100 for the beers we had last night at the speaker dinner. I Venmo you $100. I have $100 in my account, or it won't let me. But then I spend the $100 somewhere else, or I withdraw the $100. Before you withdraw the $100 I sent you, that money's gone now. You won't get it. Because it's not a real-time thing where the money actually leaves or enters your account until it's a coupon. And until you cash in the coupon, you don't have the money. And people don't realize that. They let it accumulate in their Venmo account, and then fraud happens. And mostly this is happening, from what I can tell, through Craigslist and these types of things. Somebody goes, yeah, I'll buy your MacBook. Hey, can I Venmo you the $1,200? Oh, sure. And of course, the person takes the $1,200 out long before you get home and think to cash out the $1,200 out of your Venmo account, and the money's gone. They do limit it to $3,000. Now that PayPal owns it, they've been tightening it up a little bit. The ships, there's now governance involved, and it's not just 6 jocks in Silicon Valley running it. So now that lawyers got involved, it is getting a little better, but there's a lot of holes in this system. And I just found that $400 a year thing about selling the social network information just fascinating, right? I'm guessing your bank isn't as smart as Venmo on making money on your transactions, because they were smart about marketing this to the merchants, going, you should accept Venmo because people will know when other people are shopping here, and it'll be a trend-setting, cool kind of thing for more people to shop at your establishments, and using that to market to them and do ads inside the app and things like that for nearby establishments that your friends just frequented, trying to get you to go there. So there's some profit in that. We'll see how it all plays out. I mean, the biggest user of it in America is Uber. Uber accepts Venmo. A lot of people like to use it for their Uber. Uber's another topic. Five safety tips. I found this just kind of interesting thing, just basically telling people, like, the most important thing is only use Venmo with people you trust, because it's so easy to scam you and take the money out before you get it that you really shouldn't use it except with your friends. People are weird with this stuff. I found apparently, like, it's really hip thing to do is pay your rent with Venmo now in America. They clearly don't live in Vancouver, because you wouldn't be able to pay your rent if there's a $3,000 limit, but it's just, I don't quite understand it. But I guess part of it is, I don't know the situation here. In Canada, at least, our banking system allows us to do, we call e-transfers. I can e-transfer money to anybody else in Canada. So I'm not quite sure why I would want to trust these guys, but, people are. If you travel to China, you won't go very far without seeing Alipay Pay and Alipay and WeChat Pay, or Vancouver for that matter. We have such a large Chinese population. Almost everybody in Vancouver accepts Alipay or WeChat Pay now, just because of the huge quantity of Chinese tourists we have. And interestingly, last time I was in China, homeless people have QR codes. Nobody has cash anymore, so, like, literally, if you want to give $2 to the homeless guy, you scan his QR code and you Alipay it. Kind of weird. It's used for almost everything, but this is also part of this social credit system, right? They want to, by using these things, they literally can find out everything about you, and you can use your WeChat Pay as an identifier at the doctor's office or at the hospital to receive treatment. You can pay your traffic fines, your travel tickets, all kinds of student loans. I mean, it's used for just about everything. They're starting to reach out a little further now, so you can't use this. Most people in this room, unless you're a Chinese citizen, or a resident or citizen of the PRC, you cannot sign up at the moment. So it made it rather hard to deep research, because I couldn't really use it. I had to kind of anecdotally look into what others have done, and particularly researchers in China. They are starting to expand a little bit, though. I was in Hong Kong last week, and it's starting to take off a bit there. A lot of these things always seem to be filling a market gap. The reason they exist is, like around here, everywhere I go, I can use Tap to Pay. And so I don't need Venmo. I don't need Alipay, right? Everywhere I go, I can just tap here in the UK. So there's no need for these guys to rush in and fill a market thing. Whereas in the US, sending people money is really hard because the banks don't talk. So this Venmo thing took off because people don't have an easy way to transfer money. And very similarly, in Hong Kong, it's not seeming to get much traction. In Hong Kong, most people use what's called an octopus card. It's basically your Oyster card that you use for transit. And you can just put $100 on your octopus card and use it at Starbucks or McDonald's or wherever you're going, and just, use that as tap to pay in addition to credit cards. So people aren't really adopting Alipay and WeChat Pay in Hong Kong and Singapore, even though it's launched there. Because there's no market gap, I think. And, boy, the privacy implications of this stuff are just astounding, right? And I think looking forward, from my perspective, any payment system in the future has to be tokenized. I don't really care who runs it. I mean, I think MasterCard and Visa are a cartel, but the fact is, the tokenization that they allow Apple and Google to do through Apple and Google Pay provides me a level of privacy unrivaled to anything else next to cash. So I'll take that trade-off. My risk management says that's a good deal. Less so with Tap to Pay, and even less so yet with in-person merchant transactions, because my bank does see everything I'm buying and has a lot of privacy implications to me, and they're going to monetize it unless we outlaw it. It's just inevitable. So, we have to consider these risk management decisions no different than the terminal considers risk management when it's accepting a card transaction. And that's kind of how I feel about this at the moment. I really love my privacy, and I'm just not willing to give it up unless I have to. And cash is king. I mean, in the end, cash is king. If you really want your privacy, don't use any of this crap. Use cash and guard it carefully. And if you're uncomfortable carrying large sums of cash, I'm a big fan of the Apple Pay, Google Pay, their equivalents. I didn't talk about Samsung Pay. They're an important partner of Sophos, and I shouldn't say things about them that aren't nice, and we'll leave it at that. And I've got maybe a minute or two for questions, and then we can get this back on track for timing. If not, I'd love to have a beer with you guys later or something and have a chat. I stepped into the light. Yes, ma'am.
When you were doing Tap to Pay, you did do issuer authentication. I was just wondering with like BLE systems and things like that are sort of coming in where you can kind of walk into a store and pick stuff up and walk out without a terminal.
So sort of like the Amazon shops that they open in Seattle.
How are they able to do that so quickly? So do they also skip issuer authentication, or do they skip other steps as well? Because I imagine that.
I have no idea how they're doing that. I wish I knew. That's actually, maybe I'll come back in 5 years with my update again and I'll know about that. But I mean, yes, there are quite a few shortcuts because time is super important. In fact, there's a new tap to pay standard that is not not implemented yet that Visa just proposed that is supposed to shave another 2 seconds off of transactions, even for chips, so you don't have to leave the chip in the machine as long. Again, skipping issuer authentication, some other things and going. The fraud rates are so low, we'll accept the risk level just to get customers out the door without having their chip in the terminal for 5 seconds. We'll cut it to 2 seconds, just satisfaction kind of stuff. Yes, sir.
Do you know, is tokenization, can it be compromised?
Can
someone steal my token?
The token is stored in a secure element, and it's signed with the transaction data when it's sent off. So even if the terminal wanted to, like, it doesn't have the keys to sign, and the keys are stored. So if the HSM were compromised at the bank, that would be an issue, because then all the private keys would be known, and other people could sign the token. But only the card has the private key, and the HSM has the private key, and the card's private key is stored in a secure element, which is supposed to be impenetrable, and I'm sure there's research showing it's not. But it's incredibly difficult. I'll take one more, and then I want to move for the next speaker to set up.
Hi. Have you looked at M-Pesa at all, and how it compares to chip and pin and things?
Sorry, have I looked at?
M-Pesa?
M-Pesa.
It's a system used, I think it was mentioned in Kenya.
Oh, yeah, no, I haven't.
It's leapfrogged all of these. It's allowed it's completely revolutionized the financial system in Kenya.
My reaction should suggest that no, I haven't looked into it.
It's SMS based. So you put money in your bank and then you can text someone money basically.
Sounds terrible.
Well, that's why I want your thoughts.
I mean, you've heard of SIM swapping, right? I mean, like, reading and sending someone else's text messages is not difficult.
So interestingly, African countries, and mostly South Africa, are actually way ahead of USA SIM swapping fraud.
Yeah, and I know that. I've been following how much, because they've had fraud for so much longer in SIM swapping because of the financial transactions being done over text message. They're much more aggressive about it.
Yeah, so for instance, like someone that can only have, has access to a very cheap mobile phone that has battery mass loss with it, not smart talk and text money, so it's completely changed.
Yeah, I would like to look into that. I have not.
One example is in the police force. The average wage has gone up by 30% because it used to be that the local area chief would pass on their wages. But now that they can get paid directly through M-Pesa, there's no longer the skimming of the top.
Yeah, and the social impacts of this stuff are really interesting, back to China as well with the, Alipay and WeChat Pay and social credit system stuff. Like, before social credit system, people didn't see any harm in doing this, and it just accelerated everything so much compared to cash transactions. Everybody was in, and then now that everybody's in, the whole thing's been turned on its head and become this privacy monster, and there's no leaving. So that's sometimes these things can be a trap if they're not designed well as well. But I'll leave that for the future. I'd love to chat with you later. Thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed that, and I'm happy to chat later.